indeed for this fantastic opportunity to summarize Roundtable 6, Asia-Pacific Maritime Security Cooperation and its future regional security order. I thought that this session was particularly relevant because in the first half of the discussion we talked about some of the hard power issues of great rivalry, which are actually very contemporary in the strategic debate currently. And in the second part of the discussion, it almost became philosophical at times, and we were talking about the idea of accommodation within great power relations. Now, the first session, which focused on East Asia maritime disputes and great power relations, I think it was a useful summary of all of the discourse during the entire conference. And it really mapped out, as far as in my view, it mapped out the intricacies of East Asia's maritime disputes and actually the increasingly polarized positions between the United States and China. And Xin Guangmei, I thought, started off this session in a very, very comprehensive way, but I think we were left in no doubt at all of China's determination to push its own core interests, 合心一意. I think in the second session, which was focusing on Asia-Pacific crisis control and the potential for cooling disputes and the construction of a maritime order, I thought that there were some very interesting points which came out which I hadn't seen earlier in the conference. In particular, Professor Goldstein raised the issue of Taiwan here. Now, of course, Taiwan is a deeply sensitive issue, but it really does seem to be the missing link sometimes in this discussion. And what he described was the potential outcome of a victory by Tsai Ing-wen and a DPP victory, and what that might mean for articulation by the DPP in Taiwan and the reaction of mainland China, in particular over the 9-dash line and the impacts there. But Professor Goldstein also went on to talk about how the Ma Ying-jeou administration had approached the 9-dash line. And in particular, he suggested that Ma Ying-jeou hadn't really been a troublemaker over this, but by the autumn of 2014, Ma Ying-jeou's attitude had changed. And the Taiwanese position was that had shifted in a very legalistic way towards the idea that land should determine maritime rights. So this was restricting or condensing Taiwan's claims, but aligning Taiwan much more towards UNCLOS. And there was a suggestion that Ma Ying-jeou's administration had explicitly sided with positions on UNCLOS. But he did describe a growing fissure between Taiwan and mainland on the South China Sea. And I think this is something, one of the takeaways from this discussion is that we really need to look at the dynamics of Taiwan post the presidential election this coming January. Now, Professor Zhang Renping, he also gave a very good overview of how the commercial aspects to maritime security can actually benefit China and participants in the maritime Silk Road. And this could become a very beneficial new partnership. And he talked about the existing structures in the international community which can support that, such as Asia-Pacific cooperation, cultural exchanges, and things like fishery cooperation and combined anti-piracy operations. Professor Liu Ya-wei also moved on to how One Belt, One Road, 一带一路, can really help to facilitate diplomatic cooperation. But this was also a common thread. He mentioned the possibility of free trade zones coming up within Idai-Lu and the promotion of the renminbi within that context. He also pointed out that there was perhaps a notion within China that close by neighbors, the relationship on the periphery, the 周边 relationships, are better than far neighbors. But I thought it was interesting that he pointed out that China's neighborhood, its immediate neighborhood, is still quite a fraught area. And the concept that Russia, for example, may have a not in my backyard attitude. And then further afield, there are countries like Turkey with the Islamic State crisis, and how Turkey would be reacting to, or at least the ability to accept One Belt, One Road infrastructure projects. There was the question of where the US is going to be in the Idai-Lu plan, and the possibility of jasmine or color revolutions along the way of the Silk Road economic belt. Indeed, the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Bank, the US could still exert a considerable amount of influence on this. And this was all placed within the context of 新兴大国关系, the new type of major power relations. Interestingly, we also discussed the question of China's long-standing principle of non-interference. And I think this is also linked to earlier debates where we talked about Taoguang Yanghui and whether or not Taoguang Yanghui is still relevant within the context of Idai-Lu, and whether or not new assertive diplomacy is going to be at the forefront of Idai-Lu, and the concept of Taoguang Yanghui may be being pushed more into the background. So the principle of non-interference for China was questioned when it comes to China's involvement in Libya. The evacuation of Libya is one good example. There was also the point that China still doesn't really have a national development agency. And as we move ahead with the discourse in the Nanjing Forum, the question of China's articulation of its plan for international development, I think, perhaps requires better articulation. And there's also the question of how enthusiastic the Chinese population in general is going to be, or enthusiasm for outward development, as 中国走出去, what effect this is going to have on the domestic population when there is an economic slowdown inside China. Finally, I've referred to the somewhat philosophical aspect of the discussion, and Catherine Morton and Dr. Whaley both talked about the context of a global order. Catherine Morton started out, I thought, quite interestingly, talking about adhering to the rules of the game is in the eye of the beholder. So the question is, as far as Idai-Lu is concerned, and Asia-Pacific cooling and solutions to this, if ownership and stewardship of this whole enterprise from China's point of view means that the rules of the game are called by China. But she also drew relevance to Hobbesian doctrine, Thomas Hobbes, and mentioned the need for the need to avoid the Thucydides trap. But in building a maritime order, there are very difficult counter trends, and that UNCLOS has a particular bias towards more dominant powers. And there is a divergence between global and regional order building, and the importance in the maintenance of the global commons. So she mentioned codependency between different orders, maritime rights, and reinforcing national security priorities and maritime collective obligations. Finally, Dr. Liu Ming also covered how to contextualize the global order. And she asked what the defining feature of the maritime order is. And she defined it as being fluid and pluralistic. And with pluralism, we are exposed to risks of miscalculation. And she stressed the importance of the co-evolution of norms and cooperation in non-traditional security threats. And she also says that there is increasing diffusion of power at a time when great power rivalry is becoming the focus of the strategic debate. We did have some time for discussion, and I think this was a particularly pertinent point that was made in the question and answer session, which was about this concept of accommodation of great power status. And Professor Zhu Feng made the point that in Chinese, there are at least 3 different terms for accommodation. I don't know the Chinese terms for that, but Zhu Feng can elucidate later. But the point is, I think, is that in the American mindset, accommodation can have the idea of negative connotations. And wording such as appeasement, which after World War II took on a huge negative connotation. And Michael Swain made that very clear point. I think it's also linked to this strategic question, which has been raised by both Xi Jinping and Madame Fu Ying and people like this in the strategic community, talking about strategic dissonance between the United States and China, the possibility of talking past one another. And Michael Swain raised the issue in the US and concern in the US about China's use of strength to defend its interests, and the need to recognize that Western Pacific power dynamics are changing, and the important that this does not come up to a zero-sum game. And there is a very vibrant debate in China about this. But I think one of my key takeaways from this session is that we do need to think about accommodation, this term accommodation of great power. We need to examine Chinese definitions of what accommodation means. And we also need to think about, in terms of great power status, how the United States views accommodating a great power such as China as it moves out into its great geostrategic initiative of Yidai Yilu. So those are my takeaway comments. I really have enjoyed an exciting debate and the discourse at the Nanjing Forum. I'd like to congratulate all of the organizers for their tireless and very attentive work. And I, for one part, having been involved in the Shangri-La Dialogue, think that this is really a center of excellence, and I congratulate you and wish you all the best in your forward endeavors. So thank you to the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies and Nanjing University. Thank you very much indeed.